Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Health IQ. I'm John Voorhees, and with me, as always, is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You know what? I have a bone to pick with you. And are you familiar with that?
What have I done now?
Are you familiar with that expression, though? I mean, I think this has become a weekly thing. We need to know if Federico understands.
Yes, I am familiar with that. When you have
right.
a bone to pick, it means you need to complain about something.
I do. I have to complain about being, I'm not present on Connected, and I was made fun of this week.
You were not made fun of. Your grocery list was made fun of.
I think I've gained a nickname out of that, which I don't really want to mention on this show, just so you know. Thanks to Mr. Steven.
We called you brother of the show.
I know you did, and that
is the greatest honor that we can bestow upon somebody.
All right, that is true. I will accept that as I don't know, balancing out the universe a little bit. But I also heard a little bit of the after show where I think you said that I was bad at betas, or maybe that was right during the middle of the show, and I deny it. I'm not bad at betas.
Well, let's just say you sometimes have too many betas. So it's not that you're bad at them; it's that you have too many. Maybe.
Well, sometimes it does feel like that. I will admit to that. But look, you're Mr. Base 64.
Your bone is not being picked very well. You are admitting to everything, basically.
All right. I guess I shouldn't have even gone down this path, should I? All right.
Your grocery list, though, that tweet is amazing.
It is. That tweet has gotten an awful lot of traction on the internet. Well, help from my friends, of course. But yes, that was a very funny experience to open up that list and look at it when I was standing in the grocery store and wondering what the hell had happened with, it said bread, and juice. It was a known bug at the time, and it's since corrected itself and it's gone. So I'm back to having normal grocery lists like the rest of the world.
That is good. That is good news.
All right, Federico. Well, the reason you guys were talking about betas on Connected and why all this came up in a very roundabout, circuitous way is that we got some pretty big news last week, and I'll let the cat out of the bag that we're actually recording this on Thursday, and I mention that only because things are developing, things are being discovered in the code as they are over and over again by people like Steve Troughton-Smith and Guy Rambo, and who knows what is going to come up between now and when we actually release the show. But Apple sent out the betas for 13.4 of iOS and iPadOS, a new version of Xcode, which is 11.4, as well as some other things. And we were kind of surprised, I think, by the level of changes and additions to that. And it's probably the thing that surprised me the most, and I think has been talked about the most in the developer community, certainly, is that there will now be, going forward, once these betas are out and in the world, the ability to do universal apps across not just iOS and iPadOS, but also macOS, which I think is one of the things.
And tvOS.
I know. Don't forget poor tvOS. And, I guess watchOS for that matter, too. But yes, one app can be a universal binary for all of those things. And it raises a lot of interesting issues. It raises things about Catalyst, about business models, and there's a whole bunch going on there, which we're going to get into. But first, before we get there, I wanted to kind of run through a few other things that are pertinent to our conversation today. Mm-hmm. And one of those is that the store categories are changing. And this makes sense, right? I mean, you've got certain categories that were introduced on the Mac. Was it Mojave? I think so. That are not in the iOS App Store, right, and vice versa. So there are, for instance, on the Mac, there's a developer tools section and a graphics and design section of the store that you don't have on iOS. And so those things are coming over. And so those two sets of categories for the stores are going to be mirrored from one another. And I know that you had a theory about maybe developer tools on iPadOS and iOS could mean something more than that.
Well, I guess obviously everybody's just waiting for Xcode to come to iPad. And
Right.
I think we've been ready for a few years now to see Xcode on iPad Pro. And I think at this point, all the foundational pieces, if you will, are almost all of them in place. I mean, if you think about it, the big feature missing, there are two big features missing, I guess, from Xcode at this point. And I was just talking about this a few days ago with a friend. I guess what it's missing at the moment is the ability to, obviously, to cite code and do on-device app deployment. So the ability to create an app on the device and actually install it on the device itself. And if you're a developer, you know what this means, being able to have a debugger that attaches to a process so that you can actually debug your code. But all the other technologies, I mean, are already there on iOS. You got the files, you got the, you have syntax highlighting, as we've seen with Swift Playgrounds. And there's an argument to be made about Apple maybe considering a version of Xcode for iPad in 2020 that is Swift only. And by that, I mean Swift code and Swift UI code. So doing away with Interface Builder, for example, doing away with Objective-C, fully embracing Swift, and have a new version of Xcode, sort of like the future of Xcode, which is Swift only and iPad only. I could see that happen at this point. And I mean, the developer tools section, taking at face value today on the App Store, what that means is Apple is going to allow developers of developer tools, and we have some actual examples today of those apps like JSON and Scriptable and Codia and Pythonista. There's plenty of developer tools at the moment, and letting those developers have an actual category on the App Store. So maybe that's just it, right? Maybe that's it. They're just cleaning up the App Store, bringing some consistency between the Mac and iOS. But also, it could be a sign. If you want to believe in it, you could see this is sort of like what's the thing where like a Rorschach test, what people see in
right. They see what they want to, and
they see what
patterns.
they want to. Exactly. So maybe it could be a sign of Xcode and the actual Apple developer tool coming to the iOS App Store. But at the moment, I guess it's just about unification and consistency with the Mac, because on iPad and on iPhone we do have right now some developer tools. But there's the obvious big one missing.
Right. That's absolutely true. And I'm intrigued by your idea about a Swift and Swift UI only version of Xcode, because that could be a really interesting way to kind of move beyond playgrounds and make Xcode on the iPad just the first step, and kind of allow it to evolve along with those other technologies, especially with both the language itself, but also with Swift UI, which is just in its infancy at this point.
And not having to bring over Interface Builder to the iPad, that would be, I guess it would be a big advantage, because it would mean that there's that entire portion of Xcode on the Mac. It just wouldn't be necessary because you would be writing Swift UI.
Yeah, and the thing, that's the thing about Interface Builder too, is it's one of the parts of Xcode that really requires a lot of space, because it has so many views that are laid out in kind of it looks a little bit like a flowchart when you create something in Interface Builder. You've got all the various views, and they're all connected with lines and have properties that can be set and all sorts of things. And the bigger your screen is, the better it is when working with that kind of thing. And if you could eliminate that makes Xcode a lot easier to shrink down, though even just kind of the main code editor itself does require a fair amount of space. But I could see ways that Apple could work around that. We should mention a few of the other changes. The watchOS is actually going to have StoreKit. So that means in-app purchases right on your watch, which, that there are apps where that makes sense. I think you mentioned one here in the notes, which is Carrot Weather, because Carrot Weather has it's premium subscription that allows you to get complications and other things in the watch app. So that makes a lot of sense. It'll be a lot just easier for people to access those things directly on the watch, which is nice. I got to say, I haven't really looked at the watch store on the watch more than a couple of times myself, but it's nicely done. I guess I'm not in a habit yet of looking at the watch as a place to go to buy things.
Right. Yeah. When I saw that in-app purchases were coming to the watch, I sort of I wrote it off as sort of like a joke. I mean, like, yeah, who cares about that? But then I realized now that you can have independent watch apps that are fully independent from the iPhone. I mean, it's great that you have independence because that means that functionally the app can work without an iPhone. But for a lot of developers, there was no financial independence, if you will, because you could have offered a watch app, but then if you actually wanted to purchase the full feature set, you couldn't do that just on the Apple Watch. You still had to get the iPhone app, and that meant, more friction because maybe somebody just wanted to use an app on the watch, but if you wanted to unlock all the features that were behind a subscription or an in-app purchase, well, you couldn't do that on the watch itself. So the app was only independent from a functional standpoint, but not from a financial standpoint in terms of the user experience and actually purchasing features and content. So this is great news for folks like Carrot Weather who have embraced watch independence in watchOS 6, but who also offer different tiers and different in-app purchases. I think this is a great decision, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think removing friction is a good thing, and it makes a ton of sense for an app like Carrot Weather just because, that the features that you want from the in-app purchase, if you're going to use the App Store on your watch to download Carrot Weather because you heard it has an incredible complication, you're going to be disappointed if you go there and you can't get that complication without first going to your phone. So this, I think, is a terrific addition. The next thing I want to talk about, Federico, that is going to go right into a discussion of Catalyst, I think, is what's happening with some of these APIs. And we're going to try to not get too nerdy here, but, it's funny when I look back at Catalyst before it launched last fall, one of the knocks against it initially was, it's only going to be good for entertainment apps and games. Well, the reality was, just kind of ironic, is that it's really not good for games, not at all. There are very, very few games that are built with Catalyst, and that's because it doesn't have access to things like keyboard touch events, both key down and key up controls. And if you think about it, an awful lot of games that are played on the desktop do require you to interact with the keyboard. And as a result, the Catalyst games that we've seen have been things like Steve Troughton Smith's solitaire game, which just relies on dragging cards around the screen. There's also, I've seen some word games that, you just kind of do, you're connecting letters together in a grid, kind of a word search type game. Those all work pretty well, but more traditional desktop games really have been held back by what was available before this.
Yeah, it's, the ability to have key up and down events. That is just, and I say this as a person who doesn't and has never really played games on a desktop computer, but it is essential for any kind of desktop gaming. Just because people are so used to playing games with a keyboard and a mouse on a PC, and by PC I also mean a Mac for that matter. It's something that I've never done myself, but I know that if you want to bring a game to a desktop computer, you just got to have support for controls that do not require you to hold down the command key. So just being able to, just walk by using WASD, for example, is just standard in PC games. So key up and down events for gaming are an absolute must-have feature. But I think, and I was tweeting about this today, they're just as important for productivity apps, and especially in the context of iPadOS and Catalyst when considered together. So on the Mac, we are in traditional Mac apps, so AppKit apps developed, the traditional way. We are used to having all kinds of keyboard shortcuts that may feature the Command and Shift modifier keys, but also keyboard shortcuts that may be made of just normal characters. Like, I don't know, press A in Reader to mark everything as read, just the letter A. Or, for example, in the Gmail website, if you go to mail.google.com and you select a bunch of messages and then you hit the letter E, you're going to archive everything. Or if you enter the hashtag, the character, you're going to delete messages. So this idea of the comment modifier, we are used to that on iPadOS because when Apple brought support for keyboard shortcuts to the platform many, many years ago, well before the Smart Keyboard and the iPad Pro were a thing, they were only supported by pressing a modifier key. So the iPad did not have support for key up and down events. The iPad software could not detect whether you had pressed any arbitrary key on the keyboard. You needed to add the modifier key, in this case, the command key. And that, I mean, we're growing used to that. And now we have iPad apps with a solid selection of keyboard shortcuts. But all of them, literally all of them, require you to have a modifier key associated with the character. Now, with key up and down events, what happens is that developers will be free to implement all kinds of keyboard shortcuts, so many more of them, that not only can avoid having the requirement of a modifier key, but they can also be consistent with the desktop. So, for example, if you're used to pressing E and A or R on Gmail on the web and the desktop, in theory, because Google needs to add support for this,
Right.
but you will be able to press the same shortcut, to use the same shortcuts on the iPad. And this means that a whole new, and it may sound silly, right? That a single API change can provoke this change, but an entire category of apps and so many features will be enabled by having this additional keyboard freedom of just being able to select items, for example. And this is a good example, I think. Being able to select items and then hold down Shift and do something else with them as you're dragging them around. That's an interaction that we're used to having on the Mac, right? But this idea of like, hold down any arbitrary key and change the operation that's happening on screen, that was an idea that was completely absent on the iPad before. And now it's going to be possible in 13.4, again, if developers add support for this API. But I mean, if you're an iPad developer and you have a productivity app, I don't see why you wouldn't support this, because it makes working with the keyboard so much better and it brings so much additional freedom. And in the context of Catalyst, it means you will now be able to address these kinds of functionalities on iPad and the Mac at the same time and have those keyboard shortcuts be consistent across platforms, and actually write, a single app that has the same keyboard integration everywhere. I think this is amazing.
It is amazing, and it just multiplies the number of keyboard shortcuts that are available exponentially. And when I think about it, I think about what I do when I edit in Logic on the Mac, and there are tons of shortcuts in Logic that are just single letter keys that you press. I mean, one of the things that I've done, because Logic is so much more complicated than you really need to edit a podcast, I have used things like Better Touch Tool to move a lot of the interactions I have with the app to my trackpad, because I'm always afraid I'm going to hit one of those letter keys and do something that I don't know how to undo. And, that's just because so many of the different keys on my keyboard do something in Logic. And by having that on the iPad, it's just going to open up a whole world of apps and additional, I was going to say complexity, but, complexity in the good way, which is additional features that we don't already have. I can see this sort of thing, just analogizing Logic to Ferrite. I could see this being an awfully big benefit to an app like that, where you don't have to rely as much on touch for doing certain actions. You can also rely on the keyboard, which I think is a good thing because it gives people more options.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating to see that in addition to key up and down events, we're also getting in 13.4 the ability to customize key bindings on iOS and iPadOS when a device is connected to an external keyboard, which means that as of beta 1, you can, for example, reprogram the command key to do something else. For example, I don't know, maybe the caps lock key could become an ESC key, for example. So this has been a staple of macOS functionality of mechanical keyboards on the Mac. The ability to reprogram a specific key and to have customizable key bindings. It's amazing to see Apple bringing this sort of functionality to iPadOS now. If I had to file a single request at the moment, it's a tweet that I've also retweeted today. I would love to be able to decide whether I can reprogram the left command and option keys or the right side command and option keys, because I never ever use command and option on the right side of the keyboard. I always use the left side versions.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Health IQ. At some point during the last couple of years, you've probably created or maintained a healthy habit, whether it's going out for a long walk every night, losing some weight, or just trying to get enough sleep. And you know what? If you live a healthy lifestyle, you could be rewarded for your hard work with more affordable life insurance rates. And you could save up to 41%, which is a lot. Just take the Health IQ quiz, and then they'll walk you through the entire process of applying. The policy is underwritten by one of their top insurance partners, and there's always a real person at the other end of the phone who's ready to chat with you and help you out. The savings are exclusive to Health IQ, so you won't find them anywhere else, but you do have to qualify to get the special rate. I've been trying to exercise more, even though it's wintertime, going out for long walks, working on my elliptical in my house. And you know what? I decided to try the Health IQ quiz, and it was super easy to take. You ought to check it out. It's really great. To see if you qualify, go to healthiq.com/appstories to take the proprietary Health IQ quiz. Depending on your score, as well as other related qualifying factors, you can save up to 41% on your life insurance premiums compared to other providers. Again, that's healthiq.com/appstories to let them know we sent you and to start the process with the Health IQ quiz. There's no commitment, and you'll learn even more about the potential opportunities to be rewarded for your commitment to living healthy. One more time, that's healthiq.com/appstories. Our thanks to Health IQ for their support of the show. You know, we should talk, I guess, more broadly about Catalyst too, because I got to tell you, I have been a little down on Catalyst recently, and now I'm starting to feel a little more optimism creeping in because, you know, we saw a flurry of apps that came out with the update to Mac OS in the fall. But since then, a lot of the, you know, there were some really good ones, and I covered them on Mac Stories in the past. But since then, I've mostly seen a refinement of those existing apps and not a lot of new, really meaty ones coming out. And that's been disappointing, but it's also been driven, I think, by the fact that until, you know, still there's very little documentation for developers. And there have been these hangups. There have been things that you just can't do in kind of a way that's customary on a Mac. I'm not going to say Mac-like because that seems like it's become like such a loaded term. But, you know, things that you would expect don't work the way you expect them to necessarily on a Mac when you're using a Catalyst app. And that's not often the developer's fault. A lot of times that's limitations in what Catalyst can do. And we've seen some new things, some things getting fixed with this iteration of Xcode and the betas. For instance, you know, those awful date tumblers that came over from iOS onto the Mac where they make very, very little sense. There's a new API that is a compact calendar or compact time API that is kind of funny at the moment because all it lets you do is type in the numbers for like the time or the date. Yeah, it's
that is compact.
It's super compact. It's not like a little calendar that pops up where you click on the dates like you might expect from seeing a bunch of other apps. It's really just fields that you fill in. But I expect, you know, this is the first beta. I expect there's probably more to come there. But it does, you know, it does show that Apple is listening and that Catalyst is being refined. And I think that's super important because while I know, you know, we've talked about this many times before, Swift UI really feels like the long-term future for bringing development, at least of the overarching UIs of apps on Apple's platforms under one umbrella so that it's easier for developers to develop a single app across all of these platforms. But to get from here to there are a lot of steps that have to happen. And I do believe that Catalyst is, and especially with this universal app idea that's coming to the Mac now, that it's showing that the first step is not Swift UI. The first step is a business step. It's like it's unifying the business models because I really do believe that Apple views an app as not defined by the platform on which it lives, but as an app that's available wherever the developer decides to make it available. And that's got implications for what the business models are going to be like going forward. But I think that's where we're heading. And I think Catalyst and these changes with the App Store is really getting us part of the way there at this point, as we wait for some of these technologies to get the technical underpinnings kind of aligned with that idea too.
Yeah, it feels like we're moving away from the early days of the App Store, where the app was effectively its own entity, and it was considered as a sort of like a standalone piece. So developers were working on iPhone apps, which back in the early days were completely separate from Mac apps, and quite often they were treated as companion apps. And then later the iPad came out, and developers, remember back in 2010, you mentioned this in your article, and we mentioned this on App Stories. They were working on separate HD versions of their iPhone apps.
Right.
And so that was another binary, was another SKU for developers to sell on the App Store. And it feels like this process, I guess, it started with subscriptions. This idea of like, well, it's not necessarily that that you have three separate apps. It's the same app, it's the same experience, and it follows you around no matter the device you're using, whether it's a phone or a tablet or a Mac or even a watch, and you're paying for it once, and you can use it anywhere. You can use it on all of your devices. So I think this shift, it started years ago with subscriptions, and it was also made possible. These changes, there's always multiple factors they play into them, I think. And there's the economic aspect of subscriptions and having a single business model that's integrated across platforms. But there's also the technical aspect of reaching feature parity between devices, more or less. Modern apps, they let you accomplish the same task, no matter whether you're using an iPhone or an iPad or a Mac. Look at OmniFocus, look at Things, for example, look at Ulysses, look at Carrot Weather. It's got a common set of features that are consistent everywhere. And so there's that aspect. And I think the logical conclusion of that is to have, if you ask me, a single Apple OS that is the same everywhere. Yeah. And it just scales depending on the kind of device that you're holding or that you're looking at. But that's way too long term. I think the logical medium term conclusion of this would be, yes, we still have separate operating systems, but we are moving toward a unified app store. So I guess what I see for sure in the next 5 years at this point is we're going to stop saying the iPhone App Store or the Mac App Store or the iPad App Store. It's just going to be the App Store. And on the App Store, you will find some apps that only work on certain platforms, as before. So this app will only work on the Mac, or maybe this app will only work on the watch. But most of them will be universal apps, and they will work no matter the Apple device that you own, whether it's a watch, a phone, a tablet, or glasses. I would be really surprised if Apple decided to keep the app stores, plural, separate over the next 5 years. And I think it makes the most sense to stop thinking of apps as individual pieces and more like as a single thing that you pay once, whether it's a paid upfront business model or an in-app purchase one or a subscription one, but it's the same app, it's got the same features, where possible. But again, I keep using this expression, it follows you around, in the sense that when you're using something that is useful to you, it's good to have it available everywhere. And I think that Apple also sees it this way. And I think, all the signs are pointing to this direction. And now universal binaries, when you think about it, it's such a major change. And it's such in stark contrast to where the App Store started. Like this idea that you can, in theory, starting next month. So Apple said this is starting March 2020, which is when supposedly 13.4 is coming out. Next month, you will be able to click buy once, and that action will allow you to have the same app available across 4-5 different platforms. That speaks to the strength of Apple's ecosystem, first of all, because it's amazing that to have this common foundation that a single binary works everywhere. Not so many companies can say the same. In fact, maybe Google with Android could have some sort of argument, an Android integration with Chrome. But when you think about it, when native apps are concerned, no other company can say this. No other company can pull this off at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think now for developers, as you say, it does introduce a lot of questions because it is such a major change and such a huge difference compared to the old world of paid upfront, single platform apps. It requires new thinking, and new thinking is scary for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think what's interesting to me too is that the focus of this seems to not be as much on web-based apps as we might have thought it was when we first heard about Catalyst. And by that I mean, the expectation that companies like Slack or Notion or Grammarly or GitHub, that any of them would take Catalyst and run with it and convert their iPad apps onto the Mac. Because those apps also run on different platforms like Windows, for instance, and Linux in some circumstances, I still think it doesn't really pay for them to necessarily do that. But I think what we've seen with Catalyst is, as you said, it is the one place to go if you're developing for native Apple platforms. If what you want to do is provide a native experience for users, this is how you do it across all of the platforms. And you're right, there are a lot of complications that are going to come with this. It's interesting to see that these universal apps are going to require a new bundle identifier on the Mac. And that is getting down, I guess, in the technical weeds a little bit. But what it essentially means is the unique name that identifies that app to the store is going to have to change if you're going to do this universal bundle. And as a result, that could cause problems for people who already have created Catalyst apps and now have to change because, if you change the identifier, you're essentially uploading a new app to the system, and it looks like a new app to the system. And if you do that, you lose your reviews, you have confusion with existing customers as you have to migrate over to the new app. There are a lot of potential pitfalls to that. And I guess to some degree, that may be something that Apple just sees as a cost of early adopters getting into this. But this isn't just a Catalyst thing either. I mean, this process is going to be the default for Catalyst apps, but it's also available to traditional, AppKit apps. And so those developers we're going to have this issue too if they want to offer a universal app across all of the platforms. It's interesting because that's going to be, that's always been kind of a tricky thing on the two platforms, and now there's going to be a transition that I think is going to be hard for some existing developers.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, first of all, what happens with those who embraced Catalyst at launch. Those early adopters who have already released Catalyst versions of their apps, and it doesn't look like there will be a way to have them transition to this universal system unless they drop their standalone Catalyst app and lose all of their existing customers and reviews, and then later re-release a Catalyst version. I wonder if there's maybe a universal version, sorry. I wonder if there's maybe a better way for Apple to handle all of those developers who, since September, have been releasing standalone Catalyst versions. Look at, PDF Viewer, for example, is one of them. Also, I do think that this will be the discussion at WWDC this year, like what to do in this new world. And that's even before we know what Apple is going to announce at WWDC, but what can a developer do in this new world where apps can be universal and the same app can be on the iPhone, on the iPad, and the Mac. And, we're moving away from the mindset of paying for apps 3 times. There's going to be some price adjustment going on in the developer community, especially the indie developer community. There's going to be it's going to be a bumpy transition period, I guess. So there's always some obviously missing functionalities that I think we need to address on the Mac. And I know this is one that we constantly run into as a problem. Test Flight on the Mac still
absolutely.
is not available.
Yeah, not having test flight is a real problem. I just got another Catalyst app yesterday, and I haven't downloaded it yet. I'm going to before the end of the week, but it's I guess the only reason I hesitated was because I know it's just a little bit more of a pain than it is with test flight on iOS and iPadOS. Yeah, I think economics are going to be interesting here. I think that what you're going to see is it's going to be difficult probably for developers who are just on the Mac, because by and large, the Mac has continued to support higher prices across the board. And I don't think that Catalyst had a big impact on that since it was released in the fall, primarily because the number of apps that have come over from iPadOS has been relatively small, and it's been in fairly narrow categories. But and part of the reason for that is not just that Catalyst wasn't able to handle everything that some developers needed on the Mac. It was also because not all of those iOS developers wanted to charge a separate price in the Mac App Store. That creates confusion with consumers. I know I've talked to several developers, and the process of having to explain over and over again why your app has to be paid for again on the Mac when it looks and feels an awful lot like the iPad app has been difficult. And for those developers who are already on the iPhone and the iPad, this seems to me like having the Mac app, if you can use Catalyst, is going to be adding value to your existing customers. Maybe they can charge more. Maybe they just, because they have all the platforms under one roof, it helps them compete better with apps that don't. So I think there's an opportunity here for iPad developers, and maybe, unfortunately, some price drift down when it comes to the Mac. But I think in the long run, having all of the native platforms under one roof makes sense. That makes the most sense for users, and hopefully with things like subscriptions, developers can adapt to it as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. It'll be really interesting to see what happens over the next 4 months before WWDC. I am really curious to see also what will happen in terms of iPad Pro, the iPad Pro market. If there's a new iPad Pro in March, if Apple insists on this idea that professional software can happen on the iPad, we are effectively at this point, we are in an uncharted territory. Universal apps and pro apps coming to the iPad, and real desktop keyboard integration happening by next month with 13.4. It's a very unexpected, because I don't think we were expecting this at this time of the year. It's a fun and unexpected time to be following the Apple scene and the apps community, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a
good time to do this show, John. When you think about it,
I think it's always a good time to do this show, Federico. Apple's always throwing us curveballs that are fun to talk about. And the thing is that I know you and I and Ryan were in Slack just the other day trying to think about what is it that 13.4 might have in it. And of course, we all knew that folder sharing might be part of that, because that was just about the only feature that was initially announced last summer that we hadn't seen yet and had gotten put off. But we're kind of at a loss for more things, and I think what we got was a little surprising, only because it has kind of this developer focus that you don't usually see outside of WWDC. So it was kind of a surprise, and it's definitely something interesting to talk about going forward. And it's going to be interesting to see how developers react and position themselves for this as we go into WWDC, and what the rest of the story is going to look like, because I don't think that this is all there is to it. I mean, I think this is just, in part, as we've seen in the past, Apple clearing the decks to a certain degree to get ready for new products, new, services, whatever it happens to be. And whether that's with a spring event or other things that are put off until June, I think there's going to be a lot to talk about in the next 6 months. Okay, Federico, great place to stop. I can't wait to talk about this more. I think it's been a good discussion today. I want to thank our sponsor again for this episode. That's Health IQ. And of course, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net and at Club Mac Stories. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram. He's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.